Hi, I'm Ben. I'm an animator.
Hey, I'm Drew. I'm an animator and graphic designer.
Yo, I'm Peter, and I am now a comic artist.
And welcome to the Up and Coming Artists Podcast. Woohoo!
Hey,
Thank you guys for coming on the
howdy.
show. Boom, boom, boom. What is up? As we just introduced ourselves, we have Drew and Peter over here. Thanks, you guys, for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you for having us.
Yeah, always good to have Drew on, and great to have Peter on as well. You guys can't see us because this is audio only podcast, as you all are well aware. But I can't see Peter right now, which is a little bit sad because I was just thinking about how we met at Cal State Fullerton. Do you remember that, Peter?
Oh, when was it at the is that the graphic design class?
No, okay. You might have to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was. Both of us had a break from classes in between, like at the usual lunch break. So I would come in early for one of my classes in Wendy's class, which was like room
Yeah, yeah,
185.
yeah.
And then I think you were waiting on a different class to start. And so we just were kind of like hanging out in there, and we just got to talking, or maybe someone introduced us, and we saw each other, I think, for almost that whole semester. So it was really cool to like meet you that way, because I don't think otherwise we had a class together.
I don't know if we had a class together, but I know I hung out with you while I was in a Wendy's character design class. I just took one of the seats on the side because there was kind of a problem with people having enough Cintiqs, and I'm like, well, I just bring my Surface to class all the time anyway, so I might as well just give up a seat for somebody else. And then, like, when you'd come over, we just hang out and shoot the breeze.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm so glad that we did, and it's been a while, because Drew and I graduated at the same time. I don't know if you did, Peter. Maybe you did.
I did grad. Was it 2018?
Yeah,
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 we
Peter,
did.
you and I were sitting next to each other. Ben was home animating like a boss. That's what.
yeah. I was working on stuff for an internship, but anyway, enough of memory lane. It's on to you, Peter. You're in the hot seat tonight, so we're very excited to talk about what was that?
It's a good thing I have pants.
Yeah. Well, not only, as you guys can tell listening to this podcast, that Peter's a very funny guy, but as he mentioned at the head of this episode, he is a now published comic creator. And that's what we want to talk about tonight, particularly with Haunted Halloween. Or that's what it's called, right? Hallowed Harvest. There we go.
Hallowed Harvest.
Oh my gosh, I already got it messed up. This is why I edit these things.
It's okay. It's my job to know what it's called.
So, Hallowed Harvest. So, can we talk about real quick before we even get into the comic? Just I've been doing this since we've been having to do these Zoom meetings instead of hanging out in person. How you guys are doing with making art during the midst of a global pandemic with COVID right now?
You know, it's not too different from when I would make art any other time. The big difference is that I can't get out of my house as often, and I hear most of the yelling. So that's a little different.
What about you, Drew?
It is mostly the same. I did contract COVID back in early November. I was almost entirely asymptomatic. I really don't have anything to complain about. I did my 2 weeks, went back to work. Everything was okay. In terms of artwork, things have been a little bit exciting because we have like introduced new product at my wholesale company. So those products need flair. They need carton designs. They need to show up on the website to look really nice. I'm also running our website now, which is a lot of fun. So it's been productive. It really has been. I feel like I've been growing as a graphic designer, and it's enjoyable to just like, as tough as that can be, because graphic design is really not something I'm trained in. It is nice to just go home and animate in Maya right afterwards, and I'd be doing that regardless of the pandemic. So I not too much to complain about overall.
Well, that's great. Well, it sounds like you guys have been up to a lot. So I am super excited to get to talk about that hard work. So, Peter, why don't you tell us about how this anthology comic, this crowdsourcing, all came about?
It's kind of funny because the group that I made it with, the Mythiverse, I've been hanging out with them for a little while since I made fan art of one of their characters. Is Maeve from Changeling, an Urban Fairy Tale. That was a comic that was crowdfunded by one of the other creators, a guy named Brett McGowan, like, God, a couple years ago, actually. And they got in that way, and I've been already building up a relationship with these guys for a couple years, and we're becoming good friends. And one of the guys is a guy named, he goes by James Stern. Don't bother asking if that's his real name. That's an impolite question.
He goes incognito.
Oh, we all do, mostly. Hallowed Harvest is mostly his brainchild, and he got done watching, I think it was Halloween 3. I think it was in, like, August. And one day he just, like, he pops into the chat, and he's kind of tipsy. And he's like, all right, guys, it's like 3 a.m. where I am, and I've had a couple drinks, and I had this idea. You guys need to tell me if it's dumb or not. What if we did a Halloween comic anthology? Would you guys be up for that? And I'm like, yeah, I'd be up for that. And from that point on, it was more talking to, like, our editorial staff about whether we can do that and how we would go about it. In fact, it wasn't a given that we were going to crowdfund it. It was originally going to be a patron reward for the Mythiverse. But we decided to give it a try as a crowdfunding campaign, partially to see how much interest we can gain for new talent. And what they discovered is that there was interest in it. They got that I believe it's a Kickstarter campaign that got funded. We ran 2 campaigns at the same time. One of them was a Kickstarter campaign, and one of them is an Indiegogo campaign. And the reason we did that is because Kickstarter has a very hard goal. So if you don't reach the dollar amount, it refunds all of it. You can't use any of it. Whereas Indiegogo is a little more flexible. So they had, like, the amount that they absolutely needed to pay the artists and the writers and everybody for the Kickstarter, and the rest of it is for, like, the Indiegogo is for, like, stretch goals.
Wow, that's incredible, and that's a great idea to end up doing both, so that way you can make sure you're able to get this comic out there. Now, a question before we continue on too far into it. Can you describe Mythoverse? Like, is it just a group of people that hang out and talk about art, or what is it at all?
Well, Mythiverse originally started as 3 separate people, Matt Trin, Dan Sacro, and Brett McGowan, all made different comic book crowdfunding campaigns at the same time, or they made different indie comic books. And one of their friends, I don't remember who it was, and so, oh God, they're going to slap me for this one. I don't remember who, but they were talking to a mutual friend of theirs, and that friend realized that all 3 of their books could actually exist in the same universe. So what they ended up doing is that they bundled them all together into a crowdfunding campaign and got them all funded and distributed it that way. And so the 3 books that they released were Adobe Kroger, Dame Commander, which is about a modern day paladin, which is kind of like, in that universe, it's kind of like a witch hunter, a monster hunter with magic powers. And the second one was called Mythics. That's one's like a modern wizards and stuff in an urban fantasy environment. And the third one was Changeling, an Urban Fairy Tale, which is done by Brett. And that one's about a girl who finds out that she's not actually human, but she's a changeling and has this weird identity crisis about it. They're all pretty good books. I'll send you links to them if you'd like.
Oh, thank you. That'd be awesome.
But yeah, so Mythoverse got started with those 3 people coming together and basically forming a single universe just by the fact that they were all interested in roughly the same things and made universes that were fairly similar to each other. And they decided, well, why not? Let's all combine forces here and make a comic universe. And it kind of snowballed from there.
So this is all very heavily fantasy influenced, very much a fantasy, like even kind of like horror universe that you guys are building and have built.
To a degree. I would say the term urban fantasy comes to mind because it's kind of closer to stuff like if you've ever played any of the World of Darkness games or like Vampire the Masquerade or anything like that, it's kind of a similar feel.
Something a little bit like Stranger Things, would you say?
A little bit like Stranger Things, yeah. A bit like Stranger Things, a bit like Supernatural, like all those kinds of stories that superimpose the modern world with the supernatural and the mythological. That's the kind of tone that Mythiverse has.
Gotcha. Yeah, because urban fantasy, that a name for a genre or style of storytelling like that, like I've honestly never really heard that term before until I started talking to you about these stories.
I know, I'm weird like that, aren't I?
Well, I think it's awesome, and I think it really is a genre that not only is popular right now, but also just like for good reason. It's very interesting. I think that blending of um, mythology with kind of modern technology, like you even have in your story, it just finds this really interesting place. And I don't know, it's definitely got a fan base. I'm interested in it, so that's cool that you put that into your comic, which we'll talk about in a second. Real quick, I had a question about Mythoverse coming together, and then we'll get to the comic. But so you were talking about having editors for the comic and other people involved to help make it happen. I find, and I'll set it. Don't worry, this will get to a question. I find sometimes when you have like a group, it's hard to say, oh, for sure, I have this role, unless you set up the group that way. Like, oh, say, for example, if it's a group project, oh, I'm the director, oh, I'm the producer, I'm the, animator, whatever it ends up being. So how did you guys form this Mythoverse group in order to make this book? Or did that structure just kind of come about from what people were interested in?
Yeah, it just sort of, it was very emergent, and I say we have editors and we had like a project head and all that, but it's very kind of informal, and it was very informal and just consensual. It's like everyone just sort of did what they knew they were good at and gave people the leeway that they thought they needed. And it's the kind of group, like we're already pretty close friends already, and we've already seen what we're like when we work on other projects. Like before I got to doing the comic, one of the main things that I did for Mythiverse is, well, I did two things. One is that I actually designed a Christmas card for them. And that Christmas card is actually still on their merch store.
Hey.
Yeah, that's awesome. And was that just from you getting in contact with them from before because you'd been friends or hanging out, or were they like specifically asking you to make that, or is that just something you're like, hey, this would be cool?
At the time, they announced a like Christmas card contest for the Mythiverse, so they had so it's basically like a bunch of the other artists like drafting up a Christmas card for them, and mine was the one that eventually won. There's a little competition involved there.
Oh, that's awesome.
There's that, and then the other thing that I did is that I've actually pitched a story idea to them before, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that later, but they already knew that when it came to like writing stuff and drafting stuff, because not only have I pitched the story, I had already drawn a 5-page preview of the comic. They already knew that I was good for my work and I was good on my word when it came to making content. So I already kind of gained their trust by that point. They knew that I had a good work ethic, and if I said I was going to turn in work, it was going to get turned in.
Yeah.
Actually, when you bring up just your work ethic and proving your timeliness about that, Ben, I don't know if this was a question you want to save like maybe for later, but as someone who's not into I've never made a comic, let alone with others. What's time management like for you? How do you go about handling your time and making sure things get done properly?
In my case, again, a lot of this was really informal and very blunt force. In my case, what I ended up doing as just to make sure that I had a commitment and would keep and James was basically the project head, so I basically made it my job to constantly keep him in the loop. And my hard rule was weekly updates, no matter how much you actually got done. This is actually something I learned when I was going to school with you guys. When we were doing the production classes, every week, and when we would have the project review, everybody gets together in groups and we show off the clips. The thing that I noticed was really important is just have something to show. every week you have something to show, just to show that you're making progress. Because you bring nothing in, it kind of kills the flow, and people aren't really able to help you at all. Even if you're getting like stuck and if you're having a hard time, it's better to bring in the stuff that you're having a hard time with than to just put it off until you finally make it perfect, because this is something that I need to whisper in my head more when it comes to doing my work. Perfect is the enemy of done.
That's too true. So, I mean, Drew's kind of alluding to it in his question, but let's get into the comic that you actually wrote and drew in this anthology. So can you talk about it, your idea, where it came about, and how, like you were just talking about, how did you keep working on it even when a comic can be tough to keep going?
Well, the idea itself was something that, because when James first told us about this idea, I did not actually know what kind of story I wanted to tell at first. And the funny thing is, this is actually connected to the pitch I made a little bit ago. So while I was fumbling around, I actually started digging into like old, like true horror story videos on YouTube, like people running into weird stuff and talking about it online, almost a kind of a modern ghost story kind of thing. And one thing that I ran into, and I don't know, talking about this might put me on a list or something.
A list of awesome people.
Oh yes. One of the things that I found were stories about people mistaking dead bodies for Halloween decorations.
That's disturbing, but amazing.
It is really disturbing, and it's both fascinating and horrifying how common this is. Oh, there's a story like I think it was in Colorado, where there was a guy who, on his way back to his house, he had a stroke and he collapsed on the walkway on the way to his house. And because it was Halloween, when the mailman came in to deliver his mail, he just sort of stepped over him, just assuming, oh, this is a really committed Halloween decoration. The family actually sued him for negligence because he didn't do anything about it. He's like, I don't know what else I was supposed to think.
Yeah.
It's Halloween and there's a body in front of your house. Oh, it's a Halloween decoration. Okay, that's a little grim, but you know, people do that around this time of year. Nah, it was a real dead body.
Oh my gosh.
There's more stories of that. A lot of them involve hangings, because some people will like use like bodies on nooses for Halloween decorations sometimes, and what happens distressingly often is that one of those bodies will turn out to be somebody who committed suicide in their yard. And they usually don't find out about it until like days afterwards, and somebody realizes, oh, isn't it a little weird that they haven't taken down their Halloween decorations? Oh.
Oh my gosh. That is frightening.
Oh yeah, and that's one of the things that gave me the idea. And the other thing was remembering, like, when I was a kid, or kid is a bit of a... when I was in high school, and my friends and I would hang out a lot, we actually went to a Not Scary Farm. You ever been there?
I was gonna go this year, and then COVID.
Oh no. Oof. Okay, so have you been there? So that would have been your first time ever going?
Yeah, it would have been. But I know a lot of people go. My brothers go. They love it. So yeah, keep going. This is amazing.
So the thing about the way the Not Scary Farm works is that, along with like the themed rides, and they had a bunch of shows that would go on there. And one of the other things that would have, which was kind of neat, is they would have these Halloween mazes that you go in, and they have all kinds of spooky stuff that pop out of it. Drew actually told me a story about this kind of thing being the setup for how the character Skeletor was designed.
Yeah, that's actually, there was a Netflix documentary that came out. Well, it's a little series called The Toys That Made Us, and they were talking about the inspirations that went into He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. And one of the artists mentions that his idea for Skeletor actually came from a traumatic he had as a kid, visiting a haunted house and seeing a very horrific looking dead body, like a zombie, or like just like this creepy skeleton that was kind of like had like these yellowed bones and all of that, and he
It was
found
like
out
half rotten and stuff.
half
like
rotten, yeah, and it was completely horrifying to him. And years later, like he had probably already created Skeletor by the time he even knew about this. It was years and years and years later. He's watching a news report or a documentary on TV about this serial killer who was in that area at the time, and how he hid dead bodies in like haunted house and stuff like that. And that's when he realized, oh my god, that was actually a real body the whole time.
Oh my gosh. So Skeletor's a real dead dude.
Yeah, this wonderful villain, this kind of silly over the top, yeah, was based on something far darker. It's kind of amazing.
And I may cut this out, but I just have to say, I also know Peter for being the man of great voice talent. So he just gave us a Skeletor, and it was amazing. But that's crazy. So you were like, okay, so I know that our comic from my tipsy friend is gonna be about Halloween. So you just start researching horror stories, basically, and you formulated your idea that way.
Research is a very generous term for what I did.
You were just like intrigued by all these horrific tales.
Yeah, because like every so often I'd have a phase every year where I start like getting into weird, creepy stuff. And obviously the way I usually start this is by listening to old transmissions of number stations. Do you know what a number station is?
I don't.
Okay.
Please explain.
A number station is an old shortwave radio station that when you listen to their transmissions, they'll only broadcast like, it's usually like these polytones of folk music or these like grainy recordings of people singing or music playing or like random horrible screeching noises followed by a series of numbers or code words. And then it goes back to the call sign, which would be either the music or horrible screeching noises.
Oh my gosh.
And these came about around like the late 40s during the Cold War, and these number stations are speculated because it's a neither confirmed nor denied from everyone who's asked about this. Number stations are generally believed to be espionage tools. They're used to communicate with spies out on the field as a sort of hidden in plain sight communications method. So that's one of the things that would get me started in going down these rabbit holes of like weird, horrific stuff. Because if you want, I can send you some recordings of these, but these things sound terrifying. If you didn't know what they were, you'd think that hell was broadcasting on shortwave.
It just starts playing the X-Files music, and we have a little detective work. Yeah.
I think there was an X-Files episode on number stations.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that is both amazing and terrifying at the same time, which is perfect for a comic about Halloween.
And I just ended up going down this rabbit hole, and I love finding like true creepy stories, especially that involve ghosts and stuff. But by the time I got to the rabbit hole and I found the stories about like people mistaking dead bodies for Halloween decorations, I'm like, say, that sounds like an idea. So somebody goes into a Halloween maze and finds out that the dead bodies are a little too real, but I'm like, but how would they know that? And then, Ben, you've read the book.
Yep. It's called Maze of Dolls, right?
Yep. Maze of Dolls is what came out of that. And one of the difficulties I had with Maze of Dolls is that I wasn't sure what kind of character I wanted to do this. And I remembered that the pitch, and this is why I brought up number stations, the pitch that I made to Mythiverse before for another story was about a character who actually manages to dig up what one of these number stations was and find out who's broadcasting it, and gets roped up in some weird occult adventure. And I realized that she's the person who'd be resourceful enough and nosy enough to find out what was going on in there. So it was one of those weird instances where I didn't need to create a character. I just cast a character I already made.
that's super smart. Yeah, no, that's super smart. And for everyone listening, can you describe this character?
She's never given her name in the story, but for the purposes of this story, we'll call her Brittany. That's not her real name, but it's the name she goes by in the other story. I know that's a big theme, isn't it? Nobody uses their real name. Oh yeah,
Just creepy enough for this comic.
Oh
Yeah.
yes, she's a so Brittany as a character, and this is something that only comes through a little bit in Maze of Dolls, but she's kind of thick. She's a little rotund, but she's also really resourceful, and she's really nosy. She's somebody that really likes digging up secrets and peeking where she's not supposed to. It makes her really good at digging stuff up, and you kind of see that in Maze of Dolls, where she finds out about this Halloween maze that isn't open yet, and if you remember in the story, she looks it up on her phone to see if there's any information on it. Nothing. She was like, I'm gonna be the first one to say anything about this thing.
Mm-hmm.
So she just decides to sneak in herself and gets a little more than she bargained for. But she's the kind of character that gets her nose into. She pokes her nose into places that people don't necessarily want her to look.
Yeah. Well, that's good. And I think what you're tapping into now is just like how to write a good and interesting character. And I feel like that's a really good example of a character, because not only can that be a positive, right? And in your story, she finds this maze with essentially dead people as the decorations, like you're just talking about. But also too, I love characters that their positive trait can also be a negative trait sometimes, because it'll get her into trouble.
Yeah. It's one of the things that she's really perceptive and she's really smart, but she also doesn't have very good judgment and jumps into things that will get her into trouble and might even get her hurt.
It sounds like maybe like the comic creator looking up these number stations. It just cuts to Peter getting taken away by like the government after this Zoom call is over.
I'm still waiting for them.
I wanted to ask, I don't want to make this too much of a tangent, but I also love listening to those sort of true crime mystery stories on the internet. Are there any YouTube channels that you could recommend?
Oh my goodness. I really like Lazy Masquerade. Lazy Masquerade's good. He does a lot of more true crime kind of stuff than a lot of the other stuff I listen to. There's another channel called Bedtime Stories that does a lot of cool stuff. They delve into the supernatural stuff every so often, but it seems like their mainstay is like aliens. So if you like aliens, that's something to look at.
I love aliens. My character.
But yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think that's one thing I want to get into as we move forward into talking about this anthology comic is I think what your tipsy friend really hit on is something that's really big. It's exciting tales that also kind of put you on edge or make you a little bit afraid. It gets the blood pumping, and it's like something people are really into. And so I think it's cool that you guys kind of tapped into something that isn't necessarily a specific topic, but definitely has a fan base. So with that being said, how did your guys' crowdsourcing go? Because it wasn't just your comic and there was an anthology, like we said, so there was a couple in there, right? So how did it go? And how did everyone feel about it?
Well, the Kickstarter campaign went off without a hitch. We decided that was the place where we would get most of the essentials. Though what was happening when we got the Indiegogo campaign going is something kind of happened around that time where there was a bunch of other crowdfunding campaigns going on at the same time. So it was kind of harder to get outreach there, and people obviously had more limited resources, so it was a little harder to get people to pay in after that point. So eventually we did end up funding it, and it's actually off to print now. One of the really important things that probably one of the more important things that we managed to keep up is that we kept in contact with our backers. We made sure they knew what was going on at all times. make sure everything's still Gucci. Even I'd kind of prod them every so often. I was like, so how's the print run going? We hear anything about that lately?
Mm-hmm.
And they'll tell me. I was like, oh yeah, they're still kind of backed up, or they're getting to it now, and we'll be hearing about it soon. We just got a proof copy, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a matter of keeping everybody in the loop is one of the more important things. And the other really important thing that I'm really glad that Mythiverse made sure to do, they got all their artists paid. All the artists and all the writers that were involved, they got their payment.
That's awesome.
When you're going into the crowdfunding gig, it sounds kind of corny to say it this way, but integrity is really, really important, especially because people have been burned so many times by these things that they're looking for any reason to distrust you, and they would be right to. So it's a matter of not giving them a reason to think that you're just going to pull the rug out from under them and scam them. So keeping the audience in the loop and getting your artists paid. So it's like the only like scandal, quote unquote, that can be associated with Hallowed Harvest is that the Indiegogo campaign didn't reach its goal. But that's pretty small potatoes compared to, well, everyone who backed the book is getting their book, and everybody who worked on it got compensated for their work.
Wow. That's awesome. I feel like that is definitely not the story of every Kickstarter or every Indiegogo or every crowdsourcing thing for sure. So that's great of you guys.
We've heard enough horror stories, so it's like, okay, how do we not do that? With that in mind, we are trying to move off of crowdsourcing as a primary method of attaining funding. We're trying to move more towards a sort of patron model where we use Patreon more often than anything else. And if we need to crowdfund, we don't need that much because we already got a comfortable cushion in the background. It's mostly about making sure, because we don't want to have to come up to people and like have them crowdfund books every single time, because in some ways it's kind of an exhausting process, both for the person pitching it and for like people getting involved with it, because there's always the stress of, am I going to get burned? I'm going to get burned, am I?
Well, you actually just answered a question I was about to ask, and that is sort of like the difference between what it would be like to get your projects back through something like Patreon versus something like Kickstarter. And there's probably a lot of us, like this is a world that's definitely new to me, and it's probably new to a lot of people. The difference between things like a Patreon and a Kickstarter. Patreon is like you contribute a set amount of money as a fan every month, and you get benefits because of that. While as Kickstarter is a single project. You do them one at a time. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. In terms of crowdfunding, do you think it's a good idea for others? Like, I know you guys don't want to do this, but how do you feel about people who would prefer just to do one project at a time through crowdfunding? And are there any issues you think can happen down the road with something like that?
I'm kind of glad you asked that, because it kind of lets me talk a little bit about the nuances of what crowdfunding is like. So one of the big things I think about how crowdfunding tends to work is, if you're going to do a crowdfunding campaign, you need a very large social media presence to really pull it off with any amount of consistency. You need to be somebody that has I think for most of these sort of crowdfunding campaigns to work, they need a pretty sizable following. And they need to be people that are already pretty well known and already pretty well trusted by people in general, people willing to pay money to see your work be completed. And I think crowdfunding is a very difficult game for new people to get into. A lot of it has to do with being able to secure a following that's willing to support you financially. It's a big part of why we're trying to move away from that particular model, because that model often requires that people pay a certain amount, sometimes a fairly large amount, to gain access to the work or to fund the work. And if people are going to be dropping a significant amount of money for you, as far as they're concerned, they better know what they're going to get, and they better know that it's worth it. The reason that Mythiverse is moving more towards Patreon is because having a more secure flow of income allows them more liberty to experiment. And it allows them to try out new talent, because something that Brett McGowan of Changeling said a lot is, we don't want the Mythiverse to live and die with the main 3 books. We want it to keep going beyond us. So that entails getting new talent on, which means they need a source of income to fund new talent. So that's a big reason that we're trying to get away from the crowdfunding thing, because the people who are really successful, especially in like the crowdfunding comic scene, tend to be people who were already really well known and who already have an enormous following. So I guess bottom line there is, it's really difficult for you to do it if you're new, and even if you aren't, it's still really difficult to do. And as much as possible, I would generally prefer a more stable method of securing that kind of funding or following. And what's interesting is that there's a new app out there, a new website called Global Comics. I think it's Global COMIX. And what it does is that allows you to host digital comics on there. With you can have a preview that's free and have a price tag for people to pay for the whole thing. And I think that might be a good way for new people to get recognized, is going on a medium like Global Comics.
And with that, you kind of bring up a good point, which is with maybe some of the current things, at least that I know about, like Tapas and Webtoons, you can definitely get your work out there, but it's kind of hard to monetize it, right? I don't know if you guys have studied it, either of you guys.
I have friends that have used Webtoons for this before, and there's kind of a couple hoops you need to jump through to get there for it. As far as I understand it, it's kind of on a sort of advertising monetization model, and that's not terribly reliable, especially if it can be like yoinked from under you without warning.
Actually, I haven't used the Webtoons app in a long time. I used to use it like way back in high school. There were a few webcomics I would keep up with all the time. I didn't even know you could monetize through that.
You can in some ways, but with webcomics, you would primarily monetize through like advertising and merchandise. And
that makes sense. There are always ads on the side. Yeah.
Yeah, so, and I think it's cool that you're bringing up these different ways to make money with your art. And I think that's super cool for anyone to hear about, particularly me. I may cut this out, but I'm working on my own graphic novel right now. It's going to take me probably years, so whatever. But I've been working on it over 2020 and so far this year. So I think it's cool that not only are we able to talk about how you guys managed to pull this off and to make this great anthology book, but how you can also it doesn't just have to be like, hey, we made this cool thing and that was it, but you guys actually got paid. Everyone is going to get what they paid you for, which is awesome and surprising that that doesn't happen every time. So it's awesome that you guys planned that out and did the research that it takes to be able to make this happen. I have 2 questions and they're kind of unrelated from each other. The first one is, so Mythoverse is, 3 guys, 3 stories, all existing in the same universe. Is that where they got their following from, or how did you guys get a following in order to get this thing crowdsourced?
A lot of the crowdfunding came from the fact that they were good friends with a couple of indie comics figures that were getting pretty popular at the time. I think they're the 2 ones that they're really close to is a guy named, I think it's and I'm only going to use their online handles because I don't necessarily remember their real names.
Shout out!
One of them's Mr. Marvel. He was one of the people that's pretty instrumental with them. He's actually done quite a few cover illustrations for them as as variant covers for some of their books. And the other one is a guy named Brian who works on the Rags comic. And both of those guys have been a big influence and helped out the Mythiverse a lot to kind of help them get off the ground. So they got their following in small part from getting started in a time where there was a growing demand for indie comic content and being connected with people who were already fairly popular in the indie comic scene who could vouch for them and give them a shout out. Because again, in these kinds of circles, especially in the indie comic circle, it's easy for you to distrust people and to expect to get burned by people who, if they don't outright scam you, there's people who might just never finish their work, or it takes them forever to do it and they're not very communicative about it. Like one thing that I wanted to mention about how the print run for Hallowed Harvest is going is, and I wanted to say this to contrast to hearing nothing. What happened with the Hallowed Harvest print was that we were using a printer called a Kablam, and they're a printing service that's I think it's in the Bay Area. And like I said, one of the big problems we ran into is that there was a bunch of other crowdfunding campaigns going on at the same time. And that meant that all those crowdfunding campaigns also would have gotten fulfilled around the same time, which meant they all ordered their print jobs around the same time. And most of them were going through Kablam. And Kablam was kind of swamped with all these requests for comic printouts and trying to meet all these demands. And obviously because of they ran into a lot of difficulties because of the COVID restrictions. So because of them getting swamped with all these requests and all the fun stuff that comes with the pandemic, they weren't able to deliver a lot of these prints on time, but we are assured that they're getting done soon.
Wow, that's a very interesting point. I have never even thought about that all these Kickstarters are running at the same time and everyone's going to the same people to get them printed. That's super interesting. If you were to do it again, what do you think you would do differently in order to help solve that issue? I know it's different now with COVID going on.
One of my takeaways, at least for what I'm going to be doing with my own projects, is I want to be able to get all this stuff done sooner. Like basically, because the thing about Hallowed Harvest as a concept, it was just kind of a spur of the moment thing. It only happened James only came up with it 2 months before it was meant to be fulfilled. And in that time,
wow,
we needed to write scripts. We needed to draw the comics, and it was manageable and it was fun. I like doing it, and getting the stuff done, it was a challenge for some people. But eventually we did get it done. The trouble is our real problems and our really big setbacks came with the post-production stuff. So I guess my big thing, as if I could do this and wind back time in that way, my biggest thing if I was going to do a comic project or a comic crowdfunding project or anything like that, is that I want to have it mostly done before anyone even knows that it's going to be a thing. Because that means that I have stuff to show off, I can promote it, and I can even make promotional material alongside it because I've already gotten most of it done. And if I run into any problems with printing or distribution, or something's wonky with delivery, or something goes wrong with the prints, at least I have more wiggle room and I have a little bit of more cushion time to get that resolved. And mind you, this isn't me taking digs at James for being unprepared, because again, it was kind of miraculous that we got this together as quickly as we could.
Seriously, I mean, it's 68 pages or something like that. That's a lot of work.
Yep. And we did, and it was a spur of the moment idea, and James and everybody else did as good as they could with the time that they had, and we got it done mostly on time. Our big problem was when we sent it off to print that there are circumstances outside of our control that kind of slowed us up. The digital copy, as you know, is available, is there.
Yeah. And I think that's super smart that you guys did that. So that way people aren't just waiting around. It's like what you were talking about earlier with the good communication. It's like, hey, because we're having these slowdowns, here's the comic, check it out. And we'll definitely get that real one in your hands as soon as we can.
Oh, yeah. And that's actually something that they did with the first, I believe it was the first campaign, is that they wanted to make sure that the backers at least got the digital copy of the book as soon as the fulfillment was complete. Even if they ran into issues with getting print copies, or they actually ran into issues with merchandising or selling it on an online storefront. They kind of ran into problems with that because they couldn't quite do it because of fulfillment issues with the original campaign. And it was taking a while for the digital storefront to accept it. And that's the point where we decided, like, you know what? We're just going to do it through our own storefront. I guess my other big takeaway from this is when you're doing this kind of work, to be as independent as possible and to get things done through you as often as possible, because the more you have to depend on other people, the more problems you're going to run into.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. Drew, did you have something?
Just kind of summarize like some of the things that you covered when it comes to crowdfunding. And understandably, a lot of crowdfunding campaigns, even ones that are very successful, my understanding is that typically a lot of them are done by first timers. Not a lot of people are used to raising money, crowdsourcing. In fact, I would assume the internet in recent years has made that far more of a possibility than it did like beforehand. I think a lot of artists probably didn't even think of that as like a possibility until the internet. And to summarize a few of the things that you've brought up, obviously building trust is incredibly important to a successful campaign, and building trust through communication through artists and to your fans, to the people supporting it. When it comes to, like you brought up, it's probably a good idea to have most of the work done before you even launch the campaign. Do you feel like the reason why a lot of campaigns either don't go so well or completely fail is because there's maybe a bit of a stigma, or just like this thought in the general public that I can do the campaign and then do all the hard work? Like the campaign is to pay for the hard work, or that like I can just raise the money first and then get stuff done? Do you think like that's just a problematic mentality that people going into this kind of thing have?
I absolutely do think that it's a big problem, like even outside of the comic stuff. Like I think most of the time when you hear like goofy stories about crowdfunding, it's usually about like inventions and stuff like that. And or there's a lot of them that are like movies, and they're looking for the funding beforehand to get it done. And with the movie, it's a little harder to do.
Mm-hmm.
But with a lot of these kinds of inventions, they don't have a way to mass produce them. And I do think what you're saying, that you're hitting on something there, that if you're trying to get the money first for a product that isn't there yet, it raises some eyebrows with people, and it makes them like when you go to a store and you buy a candy bar, you have the candy bar in your hand, and you hand over like, I don't know, $20, however much candy bars cost now.
And you can see the candy bar before you grab it. Yeah.
You see it, it's there, and you're going to get it. With crowdfunding, sometimes, especially with people who think that they can get all the money first, and again, I'm going to assume the best of intentions, because like the beginner kind of people who are kind of new to it are people who think, all right, I can get the money now, and I can blaze through this in a month, and I can get the comic to everybody by then, and I'll be done by then. It's like, no, it's going to take longer than that.
Yeah.
All that work is going to take a long time, and I think it's good to build up a following first. I think it's good to talk to people online, and maybe even name drop or throw some concept sketches around to kind of test the waters and make sure people like it. Of course, it's always important to make sure that you own it and you don't post it on a website that claims ownership of your property.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think when I was mentioning webtoons, there's one of those does that. I think I could be wrong.
I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. I don't know specifically, but it wouldn't be terribly shocking if I did. That's because, and I've actually been signing up to a bunch of other platforms to kind of spread out my reach, and I've become one of those people who actually reads the terms and conditions whenever I get presented with an agreement and I'm about to sign up for something.
Wow, I commend you.
Signing up for Newgrounds, I'm like, okay, do I actually own my work when I post it? Scroll, 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 read through the legalese, doop. You own your work. Okay, Gucci. Great.
Oh, it says
works.
that? It says that on Newgrounds?
It does.
Well, that's great.
And
way to go, Newgrounds.
One of their, the thing that they really get you for on Newgrounds is reposting work that doesn't belong to you and that you don't have permission to post. So it's like, okay, yeah, that's reasonable. You shouldn't yoink other people's art and post it as your own. Mm-hmm. And I looked through the terms and conditions of Pixiv, and I actually ran into this thing. I was like, wait a minute. There's a weird sentence here that makes it sound like they could seize your work if they wanted to, but it was more like, oh, wait, no. This just means, like, one of the terms in there says that art that you post on Pixiv you own, but you can explicitly give Pixiv ownership of your work if you feel like it. And that even without those permissions, Pixiv reserves the right to post your art on like the cover page or the featured page for like promotion of Pixiv as a website. And it's like, all right, that's not too bad. They're not going to like yoink my stuff and sell merch with it or anything like that, or claim ownership of it and then sue me for copyright infringement or something. It's like, okay, all right, that's fine. But I guess that's another lesson from today. Read the terms and conditions. Thankfully, I never had to learn that the hard way.
Yeah. No, and I think that's awesome that you're doing that. It reminds me of a certain character that you wrote about in your comic. But that's what I appreciate about having you on this episode is that you guys just didn't casually go, oh, well, we're going to make this comic because one guy said, hey, we should make this. You guys really put in the time. You put in the research.
The guy called in a little bit drunk and said, hey, how about we make a comic?
Yeah, which normally, and this was cool, I think, about what you guys did, is normally I feel like ideas end right there. And it's because they don't, or, people don't do, I often don't do what you're talking about, to do the research, put in the hard work, plan things ahead before you start your crowdsourcing, and you're going to make something great, and you guys did, which is awesome. So Hallowed Harvest, it will be out to people who supported the Kickstarter soon. Is there a way for people who, like myself, didn't hear about the campaign in time, but still want to support you guys, to either get the book, or if you guys have a Patreon coming up, how can we as listeners support you guys?
We do, as a matter of fact, have a Patreon. We actually recently released a patron reward that consists of spicy images of some of the Mythiverse characters, shall we say?
Ooh, I like spice.
Oh, it's very spicy. We do have a Patreon. I'm gonna look it up and get you the link right now.
Sweet.
You can buy the digital comics right off the Mythiverse website, right? I think that's how I did it.
I believe you can. You can buy the digital comics off the website. It's mythiverse.com. I'm going to go to the merch store. All right. So far the comics that we have on the store are the first 3 books and issue 2 of Mythics. That's what you got. That's what we got on the store so far. So the Patreon actually gives you access to digital editions of all of our books at the $5 tier. So you pitch in $5 per month, you get all of our comics.
Sweet. So this kind of talk about digital and print, just this is a bit of a more broad question about independent comics, and that is, do you think as time goes on, just with current technology and fast accessibility, do you think comics, at least in the more independent scene, are going to be more and more digital only, or do you think there's still an audience who very much wants to have a physical copy, something that they can hold, something that they can put on their shelf with their other favorite comics, that kind of a thing?
Well, it's kind of an interesting question because I think that sort of it varies a little bit from scene to scene, but the scene that the Mythiverse is a part of still has a pretty sizable market for physical comic books, because a lot of the people who get into its little niche of the independent scene are people who grew up buying a lot of physical copies of whether it's like comic books or manga or whatever else. So they like having physical copies. They appreciate digitals, obviously. They like getting digital copies, but they really love the physical copies. Actually, a good friend of mine who's actually a client who commissions me for stuff, he basically kind of told me, is like, I don't want you to spoil the story for me until I get the physical copy. But yeah, I think there's still a market for the physical books, if only to have like a physical ownership of it, and something that's not going to disappear if, say, your computer crashes or you lose a flash drive or something like that.
Or
Having a
if you
physical copy, yeah.
or if you die and become a Halloween decoration, you know.
Yeah, if you die and become a Halloween decoration and you bleed all over your phone, and oh no, the worst part is my digital comics are gone. Oh no. Yeah, sure.
One benefit of the digital, you'll have them on your multiple devices.
That's one of the things I sometimes think about, is how many movies I own because I bought them on Amazon Prime. What if I forget my password someday? Or
Yeah.
golly.
Or you have to wipe your computer because something went wrong with it, and then you realize, oh crap, there went all my digital comics that I spent money on.
Yeah.
Guess I'll have to buy them again.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I'm glad you asked that question, Drew, because I think it's a really interesting topic right now. And I think, and maybe this is just me and my personality, I was literally at the comic store today, but I just love getting the physical one. You know, there's something about holding it in your hand. It feels more real and it's tangible. And I don't know, there's something nice to me about not just having to like zoom in to see the full artwork, but to be able to hold it in your hand. So I think that's awesome that you guys have gotten your book crowdsourced, that it's going to be in people's hands soon, and that you guys have the digital copy for everyone else so that we can still check out this amazing work that you guys have done. So with that, Drew, did you have any more final questions?
Well, Peter, I think you answered a lot of the questions I had about crowdfunding. I was actually kind of thinking towards the end, like, so do you have any general advice for people going into it? But it feels like you've answered a lot of it. But I guess one of the things I'd really like to know about is you as an artist. What would you say are your biggest influences on your art style, on you as an artist, on your storytelling? What kind of things did you like growing up, that sort of a thing? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh my goodness. That's quite a bit. So I suppose I have two really big influences. One of them is more obvious in Maze of Dolls. One of my really big artistic influences is Jonan Vasquez. You probably know him from Invader Zim.
Mm-hmm.
I first knew about Jonan Vasquez from one of his comics, Johnny the Homicidal Maniac.
That's amazing. I've only heard of it, never read it.
I should get you a copy. It's something. It's really violent and edgy and gory. And it's glorious. Jonan Vasquez is a big influence on my art style, and to a degree, it's also an influence on my subject matter, because Jonan Vasquez likes getting into really dark and weird stuff. Like his breakout book, whose name tells you just about everything you need to know.
I love it when they're so upfront like that.
I know, it's great. But my other really big influence, and I started like diving into him a bit more, because like he is probably fair to say that this is the guy that really inspired me to create and really inspired me to start doing storytelling stuff in general. not just comics, but try to get into animation or just any kind of storytelling really, is Hiro Mashima. He's a mangaka that's responsible for the first book of his that I read was called Rave Master. And that was an fantasy adventure manga that was coming out in like the early mid-aughts. It's like 2000s. His huge breakout hit was a manga that came out later called Fairy Tail. And Fairy Tail, and by extension, almost all of his work, is basically known for the way I love describing it is he's like the popcorn flick melodrama of manga, where it's like, it's really cheesy and melodramatic and goofy, and it's just like, it just bounces between the emotional extremes a lot. But it's exactly that kind of cheesiness that I love about it.
Who doesn't love that kind of drama?
Oh, I mean, I love. But Mashima as an artist and as a writer is often kind of dismissed by a lot of people as kind of just like I said, he's just sort of popcorn flicky and fan servicey, and people don't want. Is like, he doesn't do anything terribly deep or provocative or anything like this. Like, yeah, I mean, in some ways, I'd say there's stuff about his work that's a little deeper than people give it credit for. But that actually gets into like another little thing is like, if I may condescend to give advice to artists, is go outside the approved examples of your medium, because you like what you like. It's good to draw influence from stuff that you like, not because it's on an Oscar list or it's an Eisner winner or everyone says it's the most important book or the most important movie or cartoon ever made in this century, but it's like, it's also good to, draw influence from stuff that you actually like rather than the 4 approved animes that you're allowed to like when you're in animation.
Oh, that's great advice.
Like something, and I want to bring up an example because me and Drew talked about this a lot, is George Lucas. And we're actually going through a process of watching a bunch of the movies and the shows that basically became Star Wars. And one of George Lucas's big influences is as Flash Gordon Conquers the Universe.
Shout out.
Yeah, shout out Flash Gordon, because Flash Gordon Conquers the Universe was one of these old serials that came out in, I think, the 40s. And
1936.
1936, my bad.
Roughly the 40s, yeah.
So like it was like a Depression era. It was a Depression era serial. And one thing that really stands out about a lot of these movie serials is that there's enough cheese there to open a French restaurant.
I'm stealing that. That's amazing.
It's so schlocky and it's so cheesy, but a lot of them are so sincere with their schlockiness and cheesiness that you can't help but like them. Because like at some point you just like get along for the ride and just enjoy it. And that's a big thing I want to tell artists out there is you don't have to just like the stuff that's on the Oscar lists. You can like the goofy, dumb stuff that you seem to like and nobody else does and draw influence from it and say, yeah, it's kind of like this, but I wanted to do it a different way, because even with stuff you love, that's actually another reason I recommend people draw influence from cheesy stuff that they particularly like, is that if it's not perfect, you have stuff to work from. You can rearrange stuff and you can make a story that's inspired by the original work, but you also understand that the original work isn't perfect, so you change it around in the ways that you like, or you do things with it that you like. And I bring up Hiro Mashima here. Hiro Mashima, I love the way he does characters. I love his character designs. I love his art. And I love a lot of his story, but there's some stuff that he does that I find a little bit annoying. But I still love the guy, and I see the stuff that he does that he and me differ on as points where I can go, oh, if that's something that I don't like about something I enjoy, I can do something different and make something that I absolutely know that I'll enjoy. Because, you really shouldn't hate your own work.
Yeah. Or else why are you making it?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, why are you making it?
Yeah.
You're making it if you hate it.
That's awesome. Drew, did you have something?
No, I'm just thinking of influences, because I have influences like that too. Some of the because as a kid I consumed a lot of 3D, and it wasn't just the great like Oscar winning like Toy Story and stuff like that, even though I love that to death. I watched a lot of like really trashy I grew up with the Hot Wheels movies that they made in like the early 2000s, and those were kind of like serials because they would show those in like 20-minute parts, and they amazed me. I'm like, I want to do 3D, I want to animate cars and stuff, and I have, and it's very fun. And it's funny to think, like, I look back at those, I'm like, those were so bad, but I mean, they serve a purpose still. And it's like you are also kind of I like what you said, like you have to like try really hard to be like cynical enough to hate them. They're just silly and fun and harmless. And even guys like Lucas and God knows other dudes like Tarantino or Robert Rodriguez grew up watching all kinds of crazy, violent, sort of trashy movies in the 70s too. And they're very good storytellers. So they take those influences and make something really neat out of it that a lot of people really love. And I think it's cool that you brought that up, because it's like, well, we're not the only ones who have those guilty pleasures, you know?
Well, everybody does. Everybody's
Yeah.
got something that's like, everybody that people give you the side eye if you admitted that you liked them.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's what's cool about what you're saying, Peter, and what you're saying, Drew, is when you have something like that, it makes your imagination go even more, because you're thinking like, well, I love this, why don't I like this one part, or what is working for me about this? Maybe as you get older and you watch them again or whatever, as a kid you just enjoy it, but then you think about it, why did I enjoy it so much, or why did that not work? And I think that's what makes, really, like Drew, you were just saying, those really good storytellers, because it makes you have to break it down and say, why do I like this, why do I don't? And so I think that's great, and I think that's probably what has made you guys comic, to bring it back to Hallowed Harvest, so successful, is you guys have spent the time, the research, and breaking down stories and art in general, like you were just talking about, your influences, in order to make a comic something new to put out there for people to see. And that's what I love about being able to do this podcast, is to get creators on like yourself who have been inspired, who are doing the research, doing the hard work, and then putting out artwork for other people to be inspired by. So I'm really grateful to have you on, Peter. Excuse me. And to be able to talk to you again, Drew, with great questions. So thanks, guys, for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
It's so much fun.
As always. Yeah, I know. We got to hang out, Peter. I know it's COVID, so I don't know when that's going to be, but it's been too long, man.
Oh, we'll find a way if I haven't been hauled away in a white van yet.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll be listening for the screams and the numbers in the background. So we talked about where people can go online to check out the Mythoverse. And just for clarification, it was mythoversecomics.com, right?
There's mythoversecomics.com. Mythoverse also has a Patreon. It's patreon.com/mythoversecomics. And if you want to get in touch with them on social media, they also have a Twitter and an Instagram. Search out Mythoverse and you'll find them there.
And where can we find your stuff, Peter?
Oh, well, funny you mentioned that, because I'm setting up a bunch of new stuff to put my stuff on. You can find some of my work on Newgrounds, on Nebel Art. That's Nebel Art. And the same name on Pixiv. And you can find my stuff on ArtStation under artstation.com/PT Niederbrach. That's PTNIEDERBRACH on ArtStation.
Thanks, man. Oh, that's awesome. And well, Drew, while I still have you on, where can people go to check out your work as well?
I'm on Instagram and Twitter. They're both Drew's Sketchbook. That's with two S's, DREWSSKETCHBOOK. I think I spelled that right.
No, well, Peter, Drew, thanks for coming on, guys. Everyone listening, do check out Hallowed Harvest, now that I said the name right. And yeah, and thank you guys again for your insights, for putting artwork out there, and for everyone listening at home, keep safe. and healthy during this time. And in whatever area of art you enjoy, keep on creating.